Lincoln was in trouble, big trouble. Even before the telegram arrived, running short on money and men amidst a civil war. Cartoons were showing up in newspapers. He, at the time, was grieving the loss of his 11-year-old boy, the loss of battles in the South, because his general was ignoring his advice, loss of public and political support as a cabinet member was plotting jealously behind his back. It seems that Lincoln personally was losing the North as well as the South. Here's another one of the cartoons. On the left, if you can't read it, it says, "Say, here's a way to fool all the people all the time," as though Abraham Lincoln was a charlatan, a deceiver, out to fool everybody, reflecting the lack of support. And the other one shows the lack of support even during and after the Emancipation Proclamation, with him removing the mask and showing the devil behind it, as though Lincoln himself is a devil. Amidst this rejection and outright betrayal, the telegram arrives. 303 Native Americans were convicted of war crimes by the Army during the Great Sioux Uprising in Minnesota, and federal law required that the president sign his approval of the death sentences. They were eagerly awaiting his response, a rush to judgment, a rubber stamp. And with all the pressure he was already under and unpopularity, Lincoln was probably tempted to do just what they wanted. But instead, Lincoln insists on receiving not just the names that were telegrammed to him with 303 names with a simple sentence, but the full court transcripts for each of the 303 cases to be mailed to him. And during the time when he was reviewing them, he received messages from people on both sides of the issue, including congressmen and senators and governors and people thirsting for revenge for what had been done during that Sioux uprising. They bombarded him with letters and telegrams, and Lincoln patiently listened, gave them the attention that they felt they needed. But when he reviewed court records, he found that the defendants got no legal representation during the trial to help them understand the language or even how the court system worked. They didn't have anybody to help present mitigating evidence. They rushed through all 303 cases within a matter of a couple short days. A rush to judgment, he found, led to conviction without sufficient evidence. After review, Lincoln allowed only 39 of the 303 convicted men to be executed, freeing the rest. So I ask you, how many of you already knew this story? Anybody? One hand amongst you? I found it to be fascinating. And as I looked at it, I thought of it as a love story. Maybe because of, Valentine's Day yesterday as I'm working on the sermon during the week. Maybe because of the previous sermons that I preached the last couple weeks. But to me, it shows that how with all the pressure he's already under and the hundreds of thousands of men that were dying in the Civil War, over which he presided, who are dying on the battlefield that he's being blamed for. This story shows that every single life entrusted to him mattered. He let 274 men go free, knowing that he'd make even more enemies than he had before among the voting population, leaving him with even more loneliness than he had before. He refers to himself during this time as the loneliest man in America. Did he make the right call? I believe he did. He carefully analyzed, investigated the evidence, made the right call. That's why I believe this is a love story. Not the romantic type of love story, the infatuation. Anybody experienced infatuation? I think my first infatuation was about kindergarten. When I came home and told my mother, she says with a big smile on her face, long before I ever saw my wife, I told her about some little girl in my class that I said was prettier than this whole house. My best metaphor I could possibly come up with. So no doubt, we've all experienced some sense of infatuation, that giddy, lightheaded experience. The infatuation that can cause a carnivore to eat a kale sandwich with a smile on his face. Hey, Bubba, what you eating? Huh? Didn't even realize he's eating because he's caught up with the bliss of infatuation. His feet don't even touch the ground. Should be a little picture for you coming up there. Give you somewhat of an idea of it. This is not the kind of love that I'm referring to in Abraham Lincoln's story. No, this isn't the lightheaded, out of touch with reality swoon of infatuation. That would be on the left. This is that agape love, where boots are on the ground, principle-based, low center of gravity in order to face whatever major adversity was coming his way, like an offensive lineman in the NFL, ready to face reality, not oblivious to it. Agape love is something else. See, Lincoln had no happy flight of feelings on which to draw from in this love story. They just weren't there. His feelings were not referred to endure the adversity he was about to face in order to do the right thing. In fact, listen to the description of Lincoln during this time. There's a picture to look at as I read, because we're all just sort of gloss over this picture. That's Abraham Lincoln, all right. But here's an observer. The cast of his face and body when in repose, relaxing, suggested deep, abiding gloom to nearly all who crossed his path. It appeared, one observer wrote, as if he was pursuing in mind some specific sad subject, turning it over in his mind, and his sad face would assume at times deeper phases of grief. See, it turns out Lincoln was a long-term sufferer of depression. How many of you knew that? Long-term sufferer of depression. He had friends who would hide the knives during some of his worst times. He feared to keep a pocket knife for fear of what he might do at a more vulnerable time. So he was a long-term sufferer of depression, and yet he credits his history of depression with providing him with a capacity to endure through these troubled times without any happy feelings on which to draw from, to endure the pressures he would face as a president with no good feelings coming his way. His only joy was to go forward doing the right thing. An Atlantic article in the Atlantic periodical said Lincoln's feelings were so low that he said he could end his life, but that he wanted to connect his name with the great events of his generation and, quote, do something that would redound to the interest of his fellow man. He said that it was what he lived for. And this was before his presidency, leading into his presidency. Now he's the president with all these burdens bearing down on him. He considered himself, he said, if my feelings were to be spread around the world, there would not be one happy face among humanity. That's a description of some deep, dark depression. But the suffering he had endured lent him clarity and conviction, skills to face this overwhelming adversity to help guide the nation through its greatest trial. So it turns out that research today supports the fact that depression even can result in a greater clarity of reality than happiness. Research supports what he himself said his own experience enabled him to do. That when they did tests between two people groups, one a clearly sad, depressed group, and another more buoyantly happy, and they basically did this test where you were to press a button that would affect these lights that would go off, and the fact is they didn't actually have anything to do with the lights that would go off. And at the end of the test, those who were more cheerful were more likely to think they controlled those lights, where those who were depressed said, I felt like they didn't have any influence, which reflected the reality. Meaning that that's one of many studies that have shown that you're more vulnerable to misjudge something when you're in a light, happy frame of mind. So how does that fly in the face of our culture, which keeps promoting everybody to be happy? Now, don't think that I'm saying don't be happy. I'm just saying there are times in life when our circumstances draw us down into a low, dark place. Look at all the Psalms, at least a third of them. King David saying, oh my God, help me, I'm so low. Where are you, Lord? See, we forget that lament can be part of praise. Regardless of my feelings, Lord, I know you will deliver me. You will enlighten me because you have enlightened me. I will have strength to go forward. You can say those words as David did, even though you're still in the depths of despair. So there's Lincoln did not just try to escape his sadness. He dealt with it and used it in order to continue on serving the country. Individuals, he had learned, could succeed in the greatest struggle of life, quote, only by enduring failures and plodding along with a vision of improvement. And where the optimists of his time, said the writer, would fail, he would succeed. Under overwhelming odds not to. Instead of trying to escape the darkness through ending his own life or whatever options he had at the day, he endured. So near the end of the war, With victory in clear sight, he could have given a rousing "We won" speech at his second inaugural speech. Yet, the tone carries a much more inclusive frame of mind. Notice his words. First of all, he says or acknowledges that both sides prayed to the same God, and neither side had all their prayers answered. There was over 600,000 men between the north and the south that lost their lives. And there were prayers prayed on both sides, no doubt, for their sons and to not die, for one example. So he acknowledges, instead of a happy, clappy, yippee, skippy, we won, we overcame, he starts out with that tone, a touch toward inclusiveness, and then he takes it farther. With malice toward none and charity for all, let us join together to bind up our nation's wounds. Is that powerful? Did anybody hear those words before? With malice toward none and charity for all, let us join together to bind up our nation's wounds. While both sides were against Lincoln, he was still for them. And it came through. Had he have lived, he would have no doubt led the way in that healing. So I believe, though he bore with heavy darkness, he ended up the generation's brightest star. Wouldn't you say? You know, most people today just superficially take into account that, oh, he's one of the greatest presidents, even not the greatest president who ever lived, not knowing how much he really went through to do what would result in him having been what we now say he is. Lincoln's story is a striking example of Jesus in our last couple sermons, where he stands alone, neither his enemies or his friends standing with him to support him, yet he bears all for their sakes. It's an example of him, but even more, or as much, of his end-time church. Of his church throughout the ages, really, those who were faithful to him, not just everybody who took the name of Christ, but everybody who did faithfully follow him, exercising that spirit. Right now, today, it can look like, this agape love can look like caring for an aging parent who doesn't appreciate it, might not even have the mental capacity to know what's being done for them, but it still takes that agape love to go back again and again and continue to serve. It's faithful work for a boss who's a jerk, but you're faithful, as God says, be faithful in the least of things. Whatever your hand finds to do, do with all your might. So you're being faithful to God, despite the jerk of a boss. It can be disciplining a rebellious child who resents it for the sake of his future well-being, if not your own sanity, even though you don't want to. It takes effort. It's not pleasant. There's no pleasant feelings with proper discipline of a child. You look up the work of righteousness will be peace, and the effect of righteousness, quietness and assurance forever, though it might not be at the moment, as Lincoln's example gives us. No discipline is enjoyable while it is happening. It's painful in the New Living Translation. But afterward, there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. Take courage, parents. Keep going. We need that courage on a daily basis ourselves, because when you exercise that discipline, there's often more crying and tears, but eventually it will amount to good. So, it's short-term pain for lasting glory. Lincoln's glory, has it faded or grown brighter and brighter since his demise? There were still cartoons by some individuals at the time. You might not be able to read it, but it says, "Mr. Lincoln, give us back, or give me back my 500,000 sons," as a symbol of America. This was before the total tally that we know better today, maybe. Blaming him for the loss of all the sons. And then it depicts him just saying, well, wait a minute, let me just tell another story. He was a big storyteller, but those who didn't understand just made fun of him. So he still bore with the fact that there were some people who didn't understand and didn't like him and would eventually kill him, end his life. But while he was alive, he endured with that love, that agape love, that Song of Solomon, the book of love, the Bible book of love. The whole Bible is a book of love, but Song of Solomon, all about love. Some think all about romantic love. But in the words of chapter 8, verse 6, agape love is strong as death, bringing into juxtaposition eternal forces of death and love with love. Agape love, conquering all, enduring all for ultimate victory. When the whole world turns on the commandment keepers that we are, those doing what God knows is right, will only be proved in time. You'll have to go through a dark time when there is no pleasant feelings to draw on, but sheer determination, principled love to do the right thing regardless of how your circumstances unfold. God's people will shine like stars in a midnight sky. That's according to Daniel 12:3. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Philippians 2:15 draws on that, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine like stars among them in the sky. That's God's possibility for us that we can get a glimpse of through Lincoln. That nowhere in that story I read does it even mention the word of love. But when we look at the scriptures, you find those characteristics coming through again and again and again. And even though we will face dark times, if you were born into this world and live very long, you'll face dark times. But we can take hope and courage knowing what God has led others through, He will be able to lead us through in the future. I want to read just one little glimpse of where a personal story. I'll finish with this, where Lincoln drew strength. Mary Lincoln's dressmaker once told of watching the president drag himself into the room where she was fitting the first lady. His step, she said, was slow and heavy, and his face sad. She recalled, like a tired child, he threw himself on a sofa, shaded his eyes with his hands, a complete picture of dejection. He had just returned from the War Department, he said, where the news was dark, dark, dark everywhere. Lincoln then took a Bible, a small Bible, from a stand near the sofa and began to read. A quarter of an hour passed, she remembered, and on glancing at the sofa, the face of the president seemed more cheerful. The dejected look was gone. In fact, the countenance was lighted up with new resolution and hope. Wanting to see what he was reading, she walked over and pretended to drop something so she could reach down and then get a glance of what he was reading. Do you know what it was? I'll bet nobody could guess. In the Bible. Anybody want to try a guess? Yes. The book of Job. You got to be low if you go to the book of Job and are encouraged, right? So he was low. If you find yourself in the dark, grab that Bible. And I'm not saying open up the book of Job and start reading. I remember being depressed as a Christian, not being able to figure out my way forward, and somebody recommended the book Pilgrim's Progress. Anybody read Pilgrim's Progress? The end might be good, but I never got that far because it was so depressing going through the slough of despond. I remember those words, and I'm like, man, I cannot read this. So I didn't. I've never finished that book. Someday I might go back to it. He found courage in the book of Job. That tells me you can find courage anywhere in the Bible if the Lord finds you in the depths of despair. You pull that open and draw from it, and he will fill your soul with his light and love for whatever darkness you face, because God wants to be with us. If he saw Lincoln through what he saw him through, he can see us through whatever it is we're facing. End time will come to an end. And then those who are alive and remain and those who are resurrected will see the coming of the Lord. That's what we can sing together in our closing song. Please join me in standing, and we'll sing about that glory that comes only from him.